It's an unwritten rule in entertainment that if you nail your final scene and leave the audience smiling, they'll forgive any number of mistakes that went beforehand. In gaming, that's harder than ever, because the nature of the beast involves designing a multi-hour experience that could stretch out for days or weeks on end. And stats show that only a fraction of us ever see things through. All of this is to say that if we're talking considered pacing and payoff in your average title, it's pretty much out the window. Many games put all of their efforts into the first 2/3, only to quote-unquote end out of nowhere, looking at you, Rage 2 and Control, as a myriad of reasons have gotten in the way. A development budget maybe ran out, a considerable amount of features were changed or swapped out to encourage your time being spent in the early hours, or that plot point we were building towards is now paid DLC. Most loot-based games now treat their endings as where the game really begins, with comment sections asking ahead of time what's going to be in the endgame or post-credits content. Clearly, it's very hard to stick a video game landing, but even worse is when something clearly had a way out but didn't take it. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 9 video games that should have ended 10 minutes earlier. Number 9, BIOSHOCK. There's an extremely fair argument to be made that BIOSHOCK probably should have ended with the death of Andrew Ryan, but that's actually around 2 hours before the game finally wraps up. BIOSHOCK's true cardinal sin then is dishing up a thoroughly flat, meat-headed final encounter against the naked, mutated version of antagonist Frank Fontaine. For such a smart and creative game to devolve into a shamelessly generic brute force arena fight against a hulking monster was supremely disappointing to say the least. It's a fight so crap in presentation, design, and execution that the game's director Ken Levine even apologized for it on Twitter. Cut this fight out and have the Little Sisters take Fontaine out the second you arrive in his lair. Then we could have closed things out smiling. Number 8, Prince of Persia. 2008's controversial Prince of Persia appears to wrap up with Princess Elika sacrificing herself to defeat the final antagonist ARKHAM. It's a fittingly tragic note to end on, and the credits even roll as the prince carries Elika away. Players who keep carrying Elika will find themselves able to resurrect her a few minutes later, ending the game on a bizarre bummer as the prince effectively undoes Elika's sacrifice, cutting down the Tree of Life and using its powers to bring her back to life. Unsurprisingly, Elika isn't too happy about this, considering that it also results in ARKHAM's revival, closing the game out with an admirably ballsy ending, which also left a good portion of the fanbase totally miffed. The fan outcry was significant enough that Ubisoft released an epilogue DLC a few months later, in which the prince and Elika team back up to defeat ARKHAM again, this time without Elika's demise. The simpler original ending was clearly always the way to go, and this mess of contradictory extra endings was not worth the hassle. Number 7, Half-Life. One of the greatest games of all time, Half-Life also touts one of the most wholly underwhelming climaxes ever. Though the last-minute confrontation with the G-Man is iconic, how you end up there feels like it belongs in an entirely different game. Half-Life concludes in the alien border world Zen, where it's revealed that the source of the dimensional rift is none other than Nihalan, a gigantic alien baby creature thing which serves as the game's final boss. Despite the goofiness of Nihalan's design, this is a super dull and irritating finale to conclude an otherwise incredible first-person shooter. Sometimes you just do not need a forced final boss. G-Man showing up a little earlier and whisking Gordon away before the fight even started would have been so much better. Number 6, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Despite his obvious creative genius, Hideo Kojima's games are also well known for their unrestrained excess, especially when it relates to the stamina testing length of the cutscenes in the Metal Gear Solid series. Personally, I'll take an hour-and-a-half finale for Metal Gear Solid 4, but that might just be me. While most of Kojima's most verbose cinematics are at least entertaining in their absurdity, Metal Gear Solid 2 left players about ready to fall asleep with its overextended monologue of an ending. After Raiden has defeated Solidus Snake, the player sits through an ending which, even by Hideo standards, might seem relatively modest at around 20 minutes. And yet, and this is me speaking on behalf of the critics, it's so bloated with pretentious self-imposing guff. The takeaway being that Kojima could have probably made his comments on life, purpose, and destiny in around half the time. Monologues about free will and technology set to live-action video of New York City slammed the game into a brick wall in the final stretch, when clearly all fans really needed was a quick debrief with Solid Snake and for Raiden to be reunited with his lover Rose. Instead, MGS2 became the pivot of Hideo Kojima turning into full-on Hideo Kojima that we know and love today, and that's both for the best and the worst. Number 5, Resident Evil 7. While Resident Evil 7 did a largely fantastic job of breathing life back into the flagging survival horror franchise, it really dropped the ball in its final moments, with a climactic showdown against Evelyn that fell totally flat. The fight, in which the player battles an inevitably monstrous, grotesque form, doesn't amount to much more than you firing wildly at Evelyn in what's essentially a glorified QuickTime event sequence than a worthy final boss fight. It's totally lame and honestly feels like it belongs in an entirely different game. Resident Evil 7 clearly reached its logical endpoint just before the fight, when the player encounters a vision of Jack Baker unfurling the whole tragic story of the Bakers actually being subject to Evelyn's control. The game's ending didn't need to be anything more than Ethan and Maya reuniting and getting scooped up by Chris Redfield. But because every Resident Evil always needs an overblown final monster showdown, RE7 threw one in despite it completely clashing with everything else. Number 4. Batman Arkham Asylum. Batman Arkham Asylum broke new ground for both third-person action games and the superhero genre overall, but sadly it couldn't hold on to its integrity the whole way through. Despite being Batman's most iconic foe, the Joker hasn't had that many direct, all-out fights against the Caped Crusader, mainly because Joker's strengths lie less in his physical stature and more in his playful psychological toying with Bruce Wayne. Sadly, in a desperate attempt to end the game with an obligatory larger-than-life final boss fight, the Clown Prince of Crime injects himself with the Titan formula, transforming him into the most generic final boss possible. Honestly, if Rocksteady couldn't come up with a more cerebral, authentically Batman-feeling final battle where Joker screws with the player, it would have just been better to end the game after Batman defeats Joker's squad of Titan goons. In the vast majority of Joker arcs, he tends to melt when going one-on-one, and considering how Joker eventually kills himself in Arkham City by attempting to attack Batman, it would have been a great way to show that he'll always lose either way. Instead, we got this. Number 3. Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. One of the slickest shooters of the generation that annoyingly came with enemy damage that barely let you enjoy any of it unless you were on easy, Wolfenstein 2 tends to really divide people. And while there are so many incredible highs, the beheading scene, BJ Blazkowicz confronting his abusive father, the gun handling and power fantasy feel that comes in across the second half, there's no question that it ends in the weirdest way possible. Closing out on a bizarre, heavily scripted sequence where BJ and co randomly sneak onto a TV show set, moving through the rafters until they can bury an axe in Irene Engel's face, this comes after the biggest sequence of action beats in the whole game. You've literally been to a secret Nazi base on Venus, planted boot to Hitler's face, and returned to storm the experimental ship known as the Ausmerzer. This latter level ends with your pregnant wife Anya wielding twin machine guns while pregnant, topless, and covered in Nazi blood, taking down the final Panzerhund before saying that she's done with all this. The rest of the gang reunite, and it's clear that we're gearing up for a trilogy finale. Camaraderie is strong, but then you're interrupted for the aforementioned TV level, which comes and goes in minutes, ending on one of the worst covers of Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It in human history. Number 2. Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots. It's probably fair to say that as the final game starring Solid Snake, Metal Gear Solid 4 had earned the right to dish up a self-indulgent, overextended finale. And it certainly did, with its ending cutscene running hilariously close to 90 minutes in length. Again, like I said before, I will always take this. However, while most of the ending doles out useful exposition while satisfyingly wrapping up Snake's arc, there is a point where it becomes just too much. And that's shortly after Kojima reveals that Big Boss is in fact still alive. Though the reunion between Snake and Big Boss is a brilliantly shocking moment, the wind is kinda taken out of its sails by a ludicrous amount of death fakeouts, and all pacing being forgotten about by the time he finally passes. There is only so many times a dying man can fall to his feet and get back up to continue monologuing before it becomes comical. This is Return of the King in game form. Clearly, things could have ended moments after Big Boss kills Major Zero, giving Snake and Boss the cigarette scene as the only thing the former can manage before slipping away. And number 1, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Remember Shadow of Mordor? Shadow of War kind of wiped this series off the planet thanks to being stuffed full of microtransactions, but the original saw the debut of the incredible Nemesis combat system, and it's still great to interact with to this day. The whole game held a consistent line of quality all the way to the finish line, were it not for one of the most spectacularly inept final battles in recent memory. After fighting your way through the mighty talons of the Black Hand, the player is thrown into a random out-of-nowhere fight against the Black Hand of Sauron himself, which boils boils down to an embarrassingly easy QuickTime event. This final fight left many fans infuriated and dissatisfied, with many assuming it was completely changed due to the game's rushed development. It would have been much smarter to just end the game with the fight against the Talons and your own personal nemesis. At least that would feel like the culmination of everything that you've done so far, and as Sauron literally can't die for both lore and continuity reasons, have him always be the omnipresent uber bad guy that still gets away in the end. And those are just some picks of various video games that should have ended 10 minutes earlier. Let me know your favourites down in the comments below, and please check out the WhatCulture Gaming Podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever else you can think of. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com, and I'll catch you soon.